Jesus, my Redeemer. There is no more for heaven now to give. He is my joy, my righteousness and freedom, my steadfast love, my deep and boundless peace. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus, for my life is wholly bound to it. Oh, how strange and divine, I can sing, all is mine, yet not I, but through Christ in me. The night is dark, but I am not forsaken, for by my side the Savior, He will stay. I labor on in weakness and rejoicing, for in my need His power is displayed. To this I hold, my shepherd will defend me. Through the deepest valley He will lead. Oh, the night has been won, and I shall overcome, yet not I, but through Christ in me. No fate I dread, I know I am forgiven. The future sure, the price it has been paid. For Jesus bled and suffered for my pardon, and He was raised to overthrow the grave. To this I hold, my sin has been defeated. Jesus now and ever is my plea. Oh, the chains are released, I can sing, I am free, yet not I, but through Christ in me. With every breath I long to follow Jesus, for He has said that He will bring me home. And day by day I know He will renew me, until I stand with joy before the throne. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus, all the glory evermore to Him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. To this I hold, my hope is only Jesus, all the glory evermore to Him. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. When the race is complete, still my lips shall repeat, yet not I, but through Christ in me. Yet not I, but through Christ in me. Yet not I, but through Christ in me.
Well, this morning we are looking at Mark 10. We're back in Mark 10, the verses 32 through 45, and today we're looking at favoritism. We're looking at the disciples' approach to Jesus, and they are trying to find out who is Jesus' favorite, who is the most important in the kingdom, and they've addressed this in the past. For us in our lives, we oftentimes have things that we like more than others. We like different desserts, and y'all can think of a dessert that you like best. For me, I like apple pie and ice cream. That is my go-to. Any kind of pie is definitely what I prefer. For others, you may like cookies, you may like cake. My kids and I were just talking about this the other day, and I was saying, pie is at the top, and cookies are in the middle, and cake's at the bottom. And we have things that we like more than others in many instances. In other situations, we don't have favorites. When it comes to our children, generally we shouldn't have favorites. For me, I love all my kids equally. And so my approach to them is not that I have this one as my favorite or this one is my least favorite, but I love them all equally. We understand that in life we should be willing to accept that not everything is a hierarchy. When the disciples are approaching Jesus, they're not getting it in God's kingdom. They're not understanding it, and we're going to dig into that this morning. I love that Mark, as he approaches his narrative, he's not afraid to talk about controversial things. He's not afraid to expose the craziness that is going on here in the book. He is showing that Jesus says things like, the last will be first, and that we must enter the kingdom like a child, and whoever wants to be great must be the slave of all. Jesus says things like this that are confounding and seem to be counterintuitive. Jesus is surprising. The truth he speaks is hard to hear because he's describing a foreign kingdom, a kingdom that's not familiar to any of us. And many people don't know what to do with Jesus as they see him in this text. They see him and they're not sure how to handle him. Mark not only exposes the craziness that is going on here in the text, he doesn't gloss it over, but he describes the unusual responses as well without much editorial. We've seen this throughout the book, that Mark will just say what's going on, and he won't give explanation. As an example, in our text today, we're seeing here in verse 32, let's read that together, that they were on the road going up to Jerusalem, and Jesus was walking on ahead of them. Okay, so the text is telling us that all of them, the crowd and the disciples, were on the road going to Jerusalem. Jesus was walking ahead of them, and they were amazed, and those who followed were fearful. So there's two responses here, and both are unusual. The one response is amazed, and they were amazed, many of them, because of what Jesus had said about the rich in the last story we just looked at. He has just come away from this story of the rich young ruler and saying that the riches of this young man are not enough to get him into the kingdom. That doesn't give him an advantage, and people are amazed by that teaching. And then we see also that those who followed him were afraid. And Mark just lays out the facts. He tells us this is their response. He doesn't tell us why they were afraid. He doesn't tell us why they're following Jesus if they are afraid of him. Why would they still follow him if they're afraid? But Mark just lays that out there and says this is the responses. We have this fear and we have this amazement. So we're left with some tension here in the unknown. We don't have all the information as to why some are even afraid of Jesus. But we see these unusual responses. And of course, we understand that Jesus evokes different responses. We've seen this in our own lives, in other people's lives. Sometimes Jesus evokes the response of amazement, other times of fear, other times of anger. And we understand that Jesus, being God himself, evokes these emotions. But Jesus himself is undaunted by the people's reaction. He takes his disciples aside and he tells them for the fourth time about his death. He's headed toward his death, and he takes his disciples aside And he tells them what's going on. And he says this in verses 32 through 34. And again, he took the 12 aside and began to tell them what was going to happen to him, saying, "Behold, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death, and will hand him over to the Gentiles. They will mock him, and spit on him, and scourge him, and kill him. And 3 days later, he will rise again." So Jesus approaches the culmination of his purpose. He's walking toward his death. He understands where he's going. He understands that his death will be the ultimate payment for humanity's salvation. And as the time draws near, he is sure of his destiny. And each time that he's described his upcoming death in the book of Mark, all 4 times, it has been a sure thing, never in doubt. Never, "I might die," or "I'm thinking about it." He always is saying, "I will, it's coming, I'm going to my death." He's headed to Jerusalem, and he's clearly telling his disciples what will happen. They should understand what is going to happen. He's not focused on those who are afraid or those who are amazed. He's focused on his disciples, and he's discussing with them what is going to happen, and he's preparing them for what's about to come his way. He's very straightforward here. He's not speaking in parables. He's not using any mysterious language. He's speaking just the facts. He's talking about his death, what it will look like, who will take him, the priests, the chief priests and the scribes. They will condemn him to death. He understands what's going to happen, and he's describing it very clearly to his disciples. His death and his resurrection are what he's pointing toward. And if the disciples were listening, they wouldn't be surprised when he goes to Jerusalem and is captured and arrested, tried, and crucified, and then rises again. Jesus is focusing on his death at this moment. But what are his disciples focusing on? We see in verses 35 through 41 where their focus is. Jesus has just shared this big emotional truth. He's just said, "I'm going to die." And their response comes next. James and John, the 2 sons of Zebedee, came up to Jesus saying, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." And he said to them, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Grant us that we may sit, one on your right and one on your left, in your glory." But Jesus said to them, "You do not know what you are asking. Are you able to drink the cup that I drink, or be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized?" And they said to him, "We are able." And Jesus said to them, "The cup that you drink, or I drink, you shall drink, and you shall be baptized with the baptism with which I am baptized. But to sit on my right or on my left is not mine to give, but it is for those whom it has been prepared." Hearing this, the 10 began to feel indignant with James and John. Jesus here is trying to prepare his disciples for what is coming. He's trying to tell them that he is headed toward his death and prepare them as best he can. And for him, it's a big thing. It's an emotional thing. And he speaks this truth. He says, "I am going to die." But his disciples spiral into this self-glorification. They are trying to position themselves for honor and glory, lift themselves up. We see that James and John, they start to work this private angle with Jesus to take him aside. They're saying, who's the greatest? Who's your favorite? Are we your favorite, Jesus? Who do you like more? For us, why don't you tell us, promise us that we'll be on your right and your left when you finally are glorified in your kingdom. They want to be at Jesus' right hand and left hand. And in a normal kingdom, in a human kingdom, those are positions of power. The king sits on his throne, and to his right is his first in charge, and to his left is his second in charge. Those are the positions of power and authority. And yet, we understand that this is not a normal hierarchy. What they don't understand, we do understand. Jesus' kingdom is upside down. Jesus is headed for the cross. And at the cross, he will have a man on his right and a man on his left. But they will not be in positions of honor, because Jesus will not be in a position of honor. His glorification, his position of glory will be on the cross, in his death. And on his right and on his left will be criminals that will be crucified with him. Jesus understands that, and we understand that. But James and John are jockeying for position. They say, we want to be on your right and on your left when you're honored, when you're glorified. They clearly aren't getting what Jesus is saying. And Jesus points this out to them when he says, you don't know what you're asking. They think they understand Jesus, but they don't. Are you going to drink my cup, he asks. Are you going to be baptized with the baptism I'm baptized with? If you're interested in a good study, look at the idea of cup throughout the Bible. A very interesting study. Jesus is talking here about the cup that he drinks, and we understand that in the Garden of Gethsemane, he calls out to his Father, and he says, if possible, take this cup from me. Let this cup pass from me. The cup that he has to drink is his death, but cup throughout the Scriptures is an interesting study. And he asks his disciples, are you going to drink this cup that I drink? Are you going to be baptized with a baptism that I'm going to be baptized with? And we know they can't. Jesus knows they can't, even though here they say they can. And we know that when the time came, they wouldn't even be able to pray with Jesus for 1 hour, much less drink the cup that he's about to drink. Jesus affirms that eventually they will drink the cup. They will be martyred for their faith. It's years from this point, but we understand that they will drink the cup of Jesus. They will suffer at the hands of the unjust, like Jesus did. But at this point now, Jesus is the one that is headed toward death. And then we see that the rest of the disciples don't understand either. They are all angry with James and John. They hear that James and John have tried to work this side deal, and they're angry. They're frustrated with them. They're indignant with them, the text tells us. We want a chance at that glory position. How dare you try to take that position? I want that position to the right or to the left of Jesus. They're all misunderstanding where Jesus is going, what he's doing, and he's explained it as clearly as he can to them in detail. And this same level of understanding or misunderstanding we've seen in the disciples over and over and over again. They continue to miss what really matters. Jesus has addressed this particular idea of favoritism and honor and dishonor all throughout the last few chapters. We've seen this recently. In Mark 9, they're arguing about who was the greatest. And a few verses back in Mark 10, they were rebuking children who were coming to Jesus because they weren't good enough. They weren't great enough. And if you're interested in studying that more deeply, the sermon notes on the website has more information, more resources to study that more in depth. But we see that they've been arguing about who's the greatest throughout the last few chapters. They are jockeying for position. It's very important who's honorable and who's not in their economy. But Jesus made it very clear in both these instances that the status and the power was of no value in his kingdom. Jesus is creating a king of fools and weaklings and slaves. Those in his kingdom will be persecuted, they'll be hated, they'll be mocked. And Jesus, as the king of this kingdom, he sets the example by going to the cross to die in our place. And he says, this is the standard. This is what the kingdom is made for. This is the highest good here. I am going to die for you in ultimate humility. This isn't what the disciples think they're getting into. They don't understand this. And in our humanity, everything in us fights against this. Our sinful heart wants honor, wants power, wants comfort, wants wealth, wants status, wants all these things that the world says are great. But Jesus doesn't care at all about those things in his kingdom. So when he describes his kingdom to his disciples, this kingdom of humility, they ignore it. They say, no, I think, Jesus, you're misunderstanding your own kingdom. Surely it'll be a kingdom of power and of authority. Instead of believing Jesus, they start fighting over their greatness. And Jesus, one more time, tries to get them to understand in verses 42 through 45. It says this, calling him to himself, Jesus said to them, "You know that those who are recognized as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great men exercise authority over them. But it is not this way among you. Whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many." And Jesus, as he describes this kingdom to the disciples, he contrasts the way the world views greatness with the way the kingdom views greatness. The Gentiles, which is the worldly standard, they view this authority as being great, this power over people. The goal is to move up and to gain status. That's the worldly ladder. But it's not this way among you, Jesus says. He emphasizes this point. It's not this way among you. The kingdom is different. The great will be the servant. The slave will be the greatest of all. The kingdom is different because the king is different. Let's read verse 45 again. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life a ransom for many. This is Jesus' purpose. He understood his purpose. From the beginning, he understood his purpose. He came to die to pay the ransom for many. Jesus is undoubtedly the greatest. He is God, and he has shown his power over all things. He has shown his superiority over all people, and yet the greatest will die for the least. He pays our ransom. And we understand the idea of ransom, that someone who needs ransomed is captured by someone. They're imprisoned by someone or something, and they need this payment to be released, to be freed. And Jesus uses this word, this idea, to describe our status, the status of all in the world. He has to pay the debt that is owed. He has to pay the price to get people freed. And he comes and he gives his life as a ransom. He came to pay that ransom. He's the perfect sacrifice, and his life is the perfect picture of God's heart toward humanity. He didn't just tell people to serve while sitting upon his throne and pointing to people ways they could serve him and glorify him and honor him. He came among us, dwelt among us, and he served as the least of all. He died for the least. He showed us how we must live in his kingdom. As we wrap up this portion today, I know it's a little shorter than normal, but we're doing that because I want to do what we did last week, where we took some time with a few folks in the church and talk through the application piece. We're going to talk with a couple members of the sermon team, and we're going to look at what this means. We're going to try to break it down into some practical steps to apply this passage. We understand the big picture here. Jesus came to serve, to die to himself, and we should serve like him. The disciples didn't get that in this passage. They didn't understand it. They eventually will. But we can look back at this whole picture and say, okay, Jesus served all the way to his death. We should be imitators of Christ. We need to serve as well. But sometimes the hardest thing is to move from that big idea to a practical, feet-on-the-ground application. And so we want to ask, what does this mean for me today, tomorrow? So stay tuned, and hopefully this next discussion is as helpful to you as it was to me.